We have two authors tonight. I'll go in alphabetical order, and the first is Amor Towles, who has written A Gentleman in Moscow. He is a graduate of Yale University with a master's in English from Stanford. He spent a large part of his life in the investment world, but he always wanted to write, and so he can tell you a bit about how he did Rules of Civility, and he perhaps can tell you a little bit about how that is progressing as a movie project. But his latest book has received great reviews and is part of the top 10 on the New York Times book review. So I encourage you to buy Rules of Civility also, but A Gentleman in Moscow, and have him sign it tonight at the book signing. Nell Zink has written a number of books, starting with her first book about the Wallcreeper, which is a tale of bird lovers, Europe, and eco-terrorism. She is living in Germany. She is a translator in Germany, but she actually spent a couple of years here in West Philadelphia. So her new book, Nicotine, just opened and being introduced today, and you can look for the reviews to come out over the next several days. But it's a postmodern generational cultural clash of baby boomers and millennials. So without further ado, let's give a warm Philadelphia welcome to Nell Zink.
Happy to see you all here. Today is a premiere for my new progressive bifocals. A 13-year-old girl stands in a landscape made almost entirely of garbage, screaming at a common domestic sow. The skyline of the port city of Cartagena, Colombia, stands overcast in the background, shrouded in cloud that melts to the Pacific. The sow shakes its jowls. Instead of entering its pen made of tamarisk boughs, it turns to face the girl. She swats it on the nose with a metal bar. The sow squeals, a glottal shriek. A second, larger sow approaches, gnashing its yellow fangs, with loud clicks as it snuffles over the surface of the trash. It raises its head to look at the girl, who urinates where she stands. She doubles over and screams. The pea washes stripes in the dark grime on her legs. A middle-aged American in a white shirt and khaki pants, carrying binoculars on a strap around his neck, rounds a pile of empty detergent bottles. He takes a heavy branch from the fence. He drives both sows into the pen while the girl lopes away. He calls after her, "Momento, momento, quédate, maja, ¿cómo te llamas?" He walks toward her. "Amalia," the girl says. "Ven conmigo, te doy de comer," holding out his hand. She drops the metal bar and follows him as if she had nothing to her name in the world except this one stiff, coarse, blood-stained smock. And in fact, she owns absolutely nothing but that one formerly white smock, and she never returns to the dump. 2 decades later, 2 hours into the year 2005, a cigarette fights intense humidity in utter darkness. Its dim firefly of tobacco flies upward and brightens with an intake of breath. It falls and comes close to dying. The invisible smoker lounges naked on a heap of animal skins. She is 12, brown-skinned, black-eyed, with long, dense, dark hair. Her hairline is very low, hardly more than an inch from her eyebrows, and her nose hooks like the numeral 6. Her legs are short, her waist thick, her breasts small and high. 5 tall, pale men silently walk a narrow trail broken through week-old snow. They wear mukluks and nothing else. Behind them, the steam of a burning Christmas tree rises from the chimney of a house, a 2-story farmhouse, red paint, peeling off clapboard, hunkering below the cliffs of the Palisades, just south of Nyack, New York. The night is moonlit, but overcast. The first man in line carries a kerosene torch in a bamboo holder. He's 71, the oldest person present, with white hair and a white beard. The torch trails a plume of greasy smoke, a greasy plume of black smoke. He holds it so as to spare the others, and the wind carries the smoke away. The men's boots scrape on the snow, a regular noise, like caterpillars eating leaves. The group approaches a dark mound, a sweat lodge on a wooden platform, a simple hut, built of willow and covered with deerskins. The white-haired man plants his torch in the snow. It illuminates a blue one-piece ski suit and furry mucklucks at waist level a few feet away, lying on the crust of ice on top of the snow. Frowning, he raises a flap. The smoker extinguishes her cigarette on the rim of a three-legged iron cauldron and drops it inside between two hot stones. "Is that the koala?" a younger man says, peering into the lodge. He looks very much like the old man, tall and trim and muscular, with the same full beard, his hair still black. The old man, father to him and the girl, yanks 4 deerskins off the willow frame, exposing a quarter of it, and says, "I'm disappointed in you, Penny." "Stop it," she says. "You're making me cold." "You should be in bed." "I couldn't sleep. You won't let me smoke in the house, and it's freezing out." He turns to the group. "I'm really sorry, everybody. Now I have to air out the lodge, and it's going to take time to get back up to temperature, maybe an hour." He speaks to the girl again. "Get your butt in the house," he says. "Now." Penny slithers out over the ice to grab her ski suit, puts it on, and zips it up. She wriggles into her mucklucks, brushing powdered snow off the furry shafts. She runs back down the slope 100 yards to the house. 4 men follow her. Her 2 half-brothers and 2 of her father's friends. There's light in the downstairs window. Some of the others are still awake, talking in the kitchen. From the front door, she goes straight upstairs to bed, stripping off her ski suit by the dim glow of a nightlight. She lies down under a narrow polyester comforter. The flannel sheets are faded dark red. She turns to face the wall and lies still for 10 minutes. She sits up, too unsettled to sleep. She thinks of going downstairs to ask for some water from her mother. Naked and barefoot, she ventures into the hall. Through a bedroom door at the head of the stairs, she hears a couple having sex. She opens the door and flips on the light switch. She sees the dark-haired man, her half-brother, Matt, still naked, collapsed on his girlfriend, and says, "What happened to fasting before Sweat Lodge? No food, no sex, no alcohol." Matt says to his girlfriend, "I swear to you, I'm gonna kill that fucking brat." "I swear I'll kill that fucking brat," Penny sings songs, mocking him. He withdraws and steps off the bed. He lunges at his much younger half-sister. He is right to assume she is inured to nudity, but his penis at that moment is like nothing she has ever seen. His anger, likewise. She senses a connection between the two, something exclusive to him that is not good or pleasant. She loses her sense of precociousness. She is still clutching the doorknob when he picks her up under one arm. He carries her back to her room while she kicks at his legs. He throws back the covers and drops her into bed. A silent tussle follows, typical for siblings, but not quite right. More like a father tickling his child, but still not quite right. A naked man in his mid-30s using force to hold an adolescent girl down in bed. She raises her foot to kick him in the stomach and accidentally brushes his penis with her calf. She shrieks in the shrill, spontaneous monotone of a child 10 years younger, so close to Matt that it reverberates in his ears like tinnitus. Reflexively placing one hand over her mouth and nose, he says, "For Christ's sake." She makes a fist and punches him in the chest. For him, the sensation is that of being struck by an errant ping-pong ball. Then he becomes aware that his penis, still tacky from sex, is tugging on the skin of her thigh, stuck to it. He releases her with a certain dramatic self-awareness, both his arms flying upward as though a latch had been sprung. He stands. She turns over to face downward and sobs, contracting and expanding her body in an inchworm-like way that reminds him of laughter or orgasm. He covers her with the sheet and comforts her and says, "Come on now, be quiet, you crazy kid, calm down." As he steps into the hall and closes the door, he sees her mother, Amalia, rounding the corner from the store well. "Hey, Matt," she says, "what happened?" She is brown and sturdy, 3 years younger than her stepson. "Penny had a nightmare that made her scream. She scared the shit out of us, but she's all right. Good night." He returns to his girlfriend, closing the door. Penny's face is flushed. Her eyes are red, her cheeks streaked with tears. "Did you have a bad dream?" Amalia says, sitting beside her. "Matt tried to rape me," she says, flipping over and sitting up into the light to display her tear-stained face. "Oh my God, that is a bad dream. You scared everybody in the whole house." Penny shakes her head and falls back on the pillows. Amalia kisses her cheek, buries her face in her daughter's thick hair, and wrinkles her nose. "What's that smell? You smoke cigarettes? Be honest." "Yeah." "Why you steal my cigarettes? Why don't you ask me?" Penny is silent. Somewhere inside her head, where logic matters, she rebels against the absurdity of asking permission to do something forbidden. Outwardly, in her face and eyes, she shows only remorse. When Amalia is gone, Penny rises and puts on her ski suit. She sneaks out the front door and walks uphill through the snow to the barbecue pit where the old man, now dressed in blue coveralls with a Peruvian-style ski cap on his head, is reheating the stones for the sweat lodge. "Daddy," she says. "Come here, baby. I'm sorry I got so PO'd. He tries to put his arm around her. She shrinks away. He tries to look at her face. She hides it. "Tell me, what's wrong?" "Matt tried to rape me." "And? Did he succeed?" "No." "Well, then, obviously, he didn't try." "Daddy!" Imagine you're trying to cut a baby mouse in half with scissors. Come on, visualize. She sniffles, visualizing, and says, "No way." That's right. Something stops you. If you ever got as far as trying, that mouse would be in 2 pieces. And that's how I know Matt didn't try anything. Now turn off your little narrative self-righteousness machine and tell me what happened. "Matt dragged me in his room." Where was Naomi through all this? Go back to the beginning. I want this blow by blow. I want to hear the details that don't matter, as if you were describing a dream that didn't make any sense. Penny nods. "Okay, Naomi and Matt were in their room making a lot of noise, so I opened the door to ask them to be quiet." He throws back his head and laughs. "What's funny?" "You didn't ask them through the door. You know sex is a private thing, and you know it's polite to make noises when you're having sex. At least you ought to know it at your age, and I think you do know it. I think you opened that door because you wanted to piss them off." "That doesn't give him the right..." "To do what? What did he do?" "Okay, he got mad, and he put me to bed, but it was weird." "Now you're playing dumb, pretending to be a little kid. It's my fault for not treating you like an adult after you smoked up my sweat lodge. And Matt's fault, too, for not treating you like an adult after you stopped him making love to Naomi. Do you seriously believe it wasn't just as strange for him?" Penny is silent, embarrassed. She turns away to kick at a concave bank of melting snow, stained orange by the reeking kerosene torch. "You can't have it both ways. You're not a kid anymore, and nobody should treat you that way, not even yourself. We are equals here. You take responsibility and apologize, and I'll talk to Matt. Deal? I hate Naomi, Penny says, looking at her boots. It's not our job to like her, Norm says. It's Matt who needs to love, honor, and respect her. We are all individuals. What don't you like about her? Let's see, he says, pushing a rock deeper into the embers with a length of kindling. She wants like hell to marry my senior son. What's wrong with that? She is constantly bowing and scraping to please him, and she sucks up to me and your mother. She's a bore. She's going to lose him. Now, I'm Jewish enough to wish he would settle down already with some nice girl and give me some grandchildren. Wouldn't that be nice? Little nephews and nieces everywhere? Babies are cute, Penny says. Now, if there's one thing I hope you figure out in life, it's how to learn from other people's mistakes instead of having to make them all yourself. Right now, you have a chance to learn from Naomi. There's no point in loving people if it makes you act phony, because then you can't even say, I love you. She says it all the time. She says, love and you, all right, but where's the I? It's gone, missing in action. Penny picks up a stick of her own and pokes the embers to make them glow. She smiles at her father, and he smiles back. I, he says firmly, hugging himself with his hands on his upper arms. Love, he adds, standing tall, spreading his arms high, looking at the sky. You, he concludes, leaning down to hug her close. He sways, revolving. They trample the snow. Now me, Penny says, and imitates the ritual, swaying so hard her father loses his balance and almost stumbles into the fire. And so to bed, he says. Next chance I get, I'll tell Matt you're a grown-up with all the attendant dignities and he can't push you around for any reason, no matter how much you act like a jerk. From now on, he negotiates. Deal? Deal, Penny says. Matt, in a crummy mood, trudges up to the sweat lodge to keep his annual ritual sweating appointment. It is nearly 4 a.m., and he would rather be asleep. His father confronts him. Did you lay hands on Penny? It is a striking picture. Lit by dim orange flames a little way off, the two men resemble two antagonistic big cats. One young and naked, an image of power, the other now sweet-looking in thickly insulated coveralls and a goofy hat. Matt rolls his eyes. News travels fast, he says, taking off his mucklucks. And no, I did not touch her. I was a little antsy, coming off some cocaine, and she barges in our room, okay? You will not touch her. She's 12 years old, and she's my daughter. Jesus, Norm, shut up. Matt dives into the lodge. He arranges a few sheepskins in a row and lies down heavily. Norm strips to join him. When are you going to marry Naomi? He asks as he crawls through the entry. Reaching a wolf pelt, he rolls over and sits upright. That girl loves me blindly, like a dog. She doesn't even know me. Nobody ever really knows anybody, but some women would make excellent mothers. I don't need a mother. Give me some steam, I'm cold. Norm dribbles water from a ladle over the stones in the cauldron. Talk to me, he says. Tell me why you won't start a family. Because I'm happy, Matt says. I have a fulfilling career, and I'm financially and emotionally independent. I think you miss out not having a community of any kind. And I think you miss out depending on community for your sense of self. Those clients, man, you're out there milking the most vulnerable people in the world, so don't tell me it's your community. Norm says softly, I help heal souls when bodies can no longer be healed. When they won't be needing the money anyway. I'm not here to take life lessons from you. I have my own life. I make an honest living, and I'm proud of what I do. Designing garbage trucks. Designing prototype mobile waste compactors that are changing people's lives while you're telling them life is fine the way it is, that it's fine they're dying because they rode the cosmic snake, teaching them resignation. You know why? I don't need a community because garbage trucks are necessary. I don't have to sell anybody on garbage trucks. And don't tell me your drug dealing paid for my education. I could pay off anybody's student loans 10 times over with what I made with creativity and working my ass off. So don't tell me I designed garbage trucks. I am literally saving people's lives, increasing landfill capacity so we don't have to burn that shit and fill the air with dioxins until everybody gets terminal cancer and has to come for you to trip to Brazil to ride the cosmic snake. Or would you rather we dump that shit in the ocean? Norm dribbles more water over the stones, and visibility in the tent drops to near zero. The steam hides his look of profound distress. Matt, stretched flat on his back, suddenly snores. He is sleeping.
As some of you may know, my new novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, has somewhat of an odd premise. It opens in the Kremlin in 1922 at a Bolshevik tribunal where a 30-year-old aristocrat is being interviewed. And in the course of this brief interview, it becomes clear that the Count wrote a poem as a young man that was very popular with the revolutionary generation. So he has fans in the upper ranks of the party, as it were, but it also becomes clear that he's an unrepentant aristocrat. And so he's viewed as somewhat of a danger to the new society that the Bolsheviks are trying to launch. So as something of a compromise, the tribunal says to the Count that he can go back to the Metropole Hotel where he's been staying, and if he ever comes out of the hotel again, he will be shot. And with the snap of a gavel, he's marched out of the Kremlin, across Red Square, and through the doors of the historic Metropole Hotel, which is where he spends the next 32 years. And that's where I ask you to spend sort of the next 32 years with him. Now, where did this odd notion come from? I started writing fiction as a kid. I wrote it in high school. I wrote it in college and graduate school. But I had a diversion there in the middle, as was mentioned earlier. I ended up in the investment business for 20 years. And for my firm, I traveled a good deal. And I would spend a week in any given year in a hotel in San Francisco, in a hotel in Los Angeles, in a hotel in Chicago, in a hotel in London. And in 2009, as I was coming into my hotel in Geneva for the 8th year in a row, I recognized some of the people lingering in the lobby from the year before. It was as if they had never left. And I thought to myself, this is a pretty nice hotel, but can you imagine if you actually had to live in it? And as I took the elevator upstairs, I thought, yeah, actually, that's kind of an interesting idea for a book. A guy gets stuck in a hotel for a long period of time. So in my room, I took out the hotel stationery and I began sketching the outline for this story. And right off the bat, I knew that if I was going to put my character in a hotel for 30 years, it shouldn't be by his preference. It should be by force. And that made me think of Russia for some reason. And right off the bat, I knew that I wanted to put my character in the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. Now, I had been to Moscow in 1998. I had visited the Metropole. I had passed through it. It's somewhat famous architecturally, so I wanted to go see its details. So I knew what the hotel looked like, and I knew where it was located. And there's really two reasons why I wanted to set my story there, and the first one is definitely about location. Oh, sorry. So this is central Moscow. If you look sort of right in the center of the picture, you see this little green triangle. That's the Kremlin, the great walled fortress where the czars began living over about 1,000 years ago until Peter the Great moved the capital of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg hundreds of years ago. Just to the right of that triangle, that little empty white space, that's Red Square, which is just a big paved square with a cathedral on either end of it. If you went out the top of Red Square and took a right, in about a half a block, you'd end up in this little inset area at the bottom called Theater Square. Now, Theater Square is a very famous plaza in the history of Moscow, surrounded by 5 very important 19th century buildings around planted gardens with fountains. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, I'm going to work clockwise around, you have the palace, what was called the Palace of the Nobility, which was the private club of the nobility in the 19th century. It's where they would gather to celebrate various occasions. And after the revolution, it became known as the Palace of the Unions. It's where the famous show trials were held. It's where Lenin's body and Stalin's body were held in state so the public could visit them. Going to the top of the plaza, you have the Bolshoi, the famous ballet which performed in the theater then and does now today. In the upper right-hand corner, you have the most expensive department store in Moscow, before the revolution and after the revolution. You have one of the two most important dramatic theaters in the country, and finally, in the lower right-hand corner, you have the Metropole Hotel itself. So I knew this to be a very central square in the life of Moscow. But obviously, the main reason for my interest in the hotel was the hotel itself. Everything you see in this picture is the hotel. It's got hundreds of rooms. This is taken not long after it opened in 1905. And when it opened, it was the best hotel in Moscow. It was the best hotel in Russia. It was the first hotel in the city of Moscow to have hot water in the rooms, to have telephones in the rooms, to have international cuisine in the restaurants. It had imported marble in the lobby and imported crystal in chandeliers throughout, imported stained glass in the stairwell running up through the hotel. So it was the height of elegance when it opened. Now, having said that it was relatively unique in Russia at the time, it was not unique in the West. This was the era of the Grand Hotel. From 1890 to 1910, Grand Hotels were cropping up all across the cities of Europe as well as the United States. This is when the Palace was built in San Francisco, when the Waldorf Astoria and the Plaza were rebuilt in New York City, when the Ritz in Paris. And what these hotels across Europe and the United States tended to have in common is that they were often as big as a city block. They would have fine materials, the finest materials, antiques in the rooms, a coffee house. They would have a billiard room, a card room, a telegraph office, a bank, a great palm court where you could gather for tea. And around the base of the building, you would have shops that you could enter from either inside the hotel or from the street outside. And what's important to understand about the grand hotels of this era is that to some degree they were designed to serve the new millionaires that were coming up in the late 19th century, the gazillionaires, the Vanderbilts and their ilk. But much more importantly, you need to understand that they were designed to be extensions of their cities. And to put it simply, in the decade after this hotel opened, on any Saturday night, more than half the people who passed through the lobby would have been Muscovites, not travelers. And they would have been on their way to meet friends in the coffee house, or to dine in the fine restaurant, which was the best in the city, or to dance to the orchestra that was in the ballroom or in the dining room on a nightly basis. So it really was a gathering place for Moscow society, for the intelligentsia, for the nobility, in the decade after it opened. Now, having said that the Metropole was like other hotels in Europe, what makes it distinct from the other grand hotels is that 12 years after it opened, it finds itself in the middle of a proletarian revolution. And it was very much in the middle of the revolution. As the revolutionary forces, as the First World War is going on, start to heat up in St. Petersburg, where the Tsar is based at the Winter Palace, a parallel effort is going on in Moscow. Revolutionaries are building up steam in Moscow, such that the guards within the Kremlin take over the Metropole Hotel. Because of its scale, it turns out it's the perfect bastion from which to protect the weakest flank of the Kremlin. They put snipers in all the windows of the rooms. Quite naturally, the Bolsheviks respond to this by building a barricade across the middle of Theater Square and taking up positions behind the barricade with their arms in sort of a Mexican standoff. Now, in October 1917, things finally boil over. The revolutionaries in St. Petersburg storm the Winter Palace. They take the Tsar and his family prisoners. It takes about 24 hours for news of this to reach Moscow. But when news does arrive, the Bolsheviks in Theater Square decide enough is enough, and they bombard the Metropole Hotel with everything they've got, breaking all the windows in the hotel. Now, we have an interesting firsthand account of these events from an American. John Reed, the great American journalist, who Warren Beatty depicted famously in Reds, went to Russia as things were heating up. He was in St. Petersburg and followed the revolutionary troops right into the Winter Palace when they stormed it and seized the Tsar. After the seizure of the Winter Palace, he decided he wanted to go see what's happening in Moscow. So he jumps on an overnight train filled with soldiers, goes into Moscow. When he arrives, he goes straight to the Metropole Hotel because he knows it by reputation. He needs a place to stay. walks into the Metropole Hotel, and as he recounts in 10 Days That Shook the World, he goes up to the captain at the desk and asks for a room, and the captain, in this great unflappable fashion, says, "We do have a room, as long as the gentleman doesn't mind a little fresh air," because there were no windows in the hotel. But suffice to say that with the seizure of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the capture of the Tsar, the era of the Tsardom is over. But the hostilities are not. What happens is that a civil war begins in Russia that lasts for 5 years. And initially, there are white soldiers, white guards, which are the troops that were loyal to the Tsar that are still roaming the country in pitched battles with the interest of restoring the regime. 8 foreign countries send soldiers with their own agendas. The Bolsheviks are there, but so there are multiple revolutionary factions vying for control. Now, pretty early on, the Bolsheviks are gaining the upper hand. So they're kind of running the show for the most part, but it's still a pitched battle. This photograph you may recognize. It's one of the most famous photographs we have of Lenin. I like to think of this as his Leonardo DiCaprio in the Titanic pose, kind of leaning over the bow there. But this is Theater Square, which I showed you a second ago. That's the Malley Theater behind him. And the little sliver of a building on the right is the edge of the Metropole Hotel. The Theater Square was a place where they would gather large crowds. It was a good place for rallying. In this case, he is speaking to workers, trying to convince them to join the Red Army and go protect the Polish front. Because the Bolsheviks, even though they were getting the upper hand in the country, they were very worried about Western armies invading and taking advantage of the sort of the turbulence in the country. Now, this picture also is kind of very interesting from a historical standpoint, because Lenin, of course, was one of the leaders of the revolution and ultimately the Russian government, the new Bolshevik government. His closest ally, really, was Trotsky, as a revolutionary leader and as the head of the government. And Trotsky is standing right on the podium a few feet from Lenin, but don't bother looking for him, because here he is, right here, there, with the mustache and the captain's hat. You can see these two pictures are seconds apart. The reason he's not in the other picture, because in addition to being one of the first 2 people to really lead the revolution and run the government, he was also the first person to really fall out of favor. And so not long after the revolution, he was kicked out of the party, he was exiled, he was ultimately assassinated in Mexico. And so in the years after that, they airbrushed him out of this famous photograph, because they didn't want Lenin to have to share this historic moment with the out-of-favor Trotsky. So suffice to say that at this point, what happens is that over the course of this short period, the Bolsheviks do gain control of the country. In 1922, the Civil War is over. And the first thing that the Bolsheviks do is that they move the capital of Russia from St. Petersburg back to Moscow. Now, this poses a significant problem for them, because Moscow did not have the infrastructure to support a modern government. The Kremlin was just an old stone building that hadn't been used in hundreds of years for that purpose at all. So what they do is they seize the 3 best hotels in the city. And the Metropole becomes the second house of the Soviets. They push aside all the luxuries, and first thing they do is they put in the new leaders of the government into the suites of the hotel. You want to remember that the leaders of the communist government, very few of them were Muscovites. Many of them weren't even Russians. So they actually needed a place to stay. But the other rooms were used for all kinds of administrative and departmental offices. There were clerical offices, secretarial pools. The ballroom was used as an assembly room for large crowds, unlike this one, for votes. The fine restaurant was cleared out and became a barracks for soldiers. So you might think that at that moment, the Metropole's life as a grand hotel should have screeched to a halt. But an interesting thing happens over the course of 1922. Which is that the major European countries start to recognize the Bolshevik government as the legitimate government in Russia. It takes America more than a decade to come around to that point of view. But the major European countries do it very quickly. And so ambassadors begin to show up in Moscow, trade representatives from the major European governments, corporate executives from across Europe and the United States appear, eager to do business with the new powers that be as early as possible. And as these individuals are coming to Moscow, the Bolsheviks realize pretty quickly that if they put these people up in crummy proletariat hotels, they will go back to New York or London or Paris with the news that the revolution was failing. So they kicked all the party guys out of the metropole, and they put the uniforms back on the bellhops, back on the doormen out front. Champagne and caviar once again began to flow in the restaurant. They reassembled the orchestra, and immediately it began playing American jazz on a nightly basis. Now, initially, the sole beneficiaries of this returned glamour are the foreigners. And in fact, there's an ordinance in Moscow which forbids Muscovites from eating in the restaurant or dancing in the ballroom of the metropole and other foreign designated places. But the community of the metropole broadens in two waves. The first wave is that the leaders of the Communist Party decide that hanging out in the metropole isn't so bad. It's kind of a nice place to hang out. The furniture's nice, the food's good, the music sounds nice, so they start hanging out there. Now, I think if you ask many Americans what percentage of the Russian population were communists during the era of 1920s, 30s, 40s into the Cold War, many would say 90%, three-quarters, certainly more than half. In fact, it was about 10% of the population were communists. And this isn't because the other 90% didn't want to be communists. It's because the other 90% weren't allowed to be communists. In the early stages, before the war, membership in the Communist Party was a sign of ideological purity. If you were a member of the party, it's because you could quote your Marx and Engels, because you had printed pamphlets and maybe even done time during the Tsar's reign. You certainly fought in the war. And this made you a member of the party. But in the aftermath of the revolution, quite quickly, membership in the Communist Party became a gateway to privilege. If you were a member of the party, you had access to better apartment buildings with bigger apartments that your family didn't have to share. You had access to better grocery stores that not only had bread and milk on a daily basis, but actually had delicacies. You were treated better by the judicial system. Your children had better opportunities. So there was a big advantage to being a member of the Communist Party during the Stalinist era, and membership was doled out one person at a time based on those people who had proven their worth. So this is the first group who joins the foreigners in the rejuvenated Metropole Hotel. But the second wave is a bigger wave, and this wave is brought about by a financial crisis. So what I want you to remember is that at the time of the First World War, Russia was the most backward of all the major Western European nations. It had 95% illiteracy. 90% of the population were peasants. Almost no industrialization. Way behind England, Germany, America. So what the Bolsheviks wanted to do in the aftermath of the war, first off, was to vault over decades of underinvestment and bring Russia to the forefront of modern industrial nations. Quite amazingly, at a significant social cost, they achieved this goal over 30 years. Because keep in mind that by 1950, they were the second most powerful nation in the world, other than America, without question. So in the early stages, the goal was to ramp up industrialization. That's what the 5-year plans were for. But in order to do that, they needed to buy equipment and expertise from the West. They didn't have any at home. Not surprisingly, the major Western European countries and America were willing to sell these services and equipment, but were not very interested in taking Russian currency, the new Russian currency, or IOUs for that matter. What they wanted were hard currencies. So the Swiss franc, the British pound, the American dollar, gold. This is what they wanted in exchange for their services and equipment. Initially, the Bolsheviks had a lot of this. They had seized it, and they used that to fund these purchase efforts, but they began to run out. The good news is that there was a lot of hard currency in Russia. It's just that it was under the mattresses of the citizens. The citizens were hoarding the foreign currencies that they used to have because it was a very effective tool in the black market to buy goods, and it was sort of a safe haven. So it was out there. So the Bolsheviks come up with this ingenious notion, which is they say, all right, you can, as Muscovites, you can come back to the metropole. You can dine in the metropole. But if you're going to do so, you have to buy services with foreign currency. And through this compromise, the Moscow populace regains access to the hotel, and the Bolsheviks start to rake in the foreign currencies to fund the modernization efforts. Now, this is obviously what intrigues me about this hotel, is that here around the corner from the Kremlin, a few blocks from the headquarters of the secret police, is a restored environment of glamour, luxury, and liberty. Now, just so you know that I'm not making this up, I'll show you this first of all, just quickly. That's the dining room of the Metropole. That's about half of it. And you can kind of think of that when I read this passage to you. So you know that I'm not making this up. I'm going to read you quickly a passage from Eugene Lyons, who is the United Press International Moscow correspondent at the end of the 20s and the early 30s. And this is him describing life in the hotel, where he spent a lot of time. All the journalists drank there. And keep in mind that in the early 30s, this is the time frame of the famine in the Ukraine, where millions die, a great period of great shortages in Russia, and it's a couple of years before the great purges really get underway. But this is life in the hotel, according to Eugene Lyons. Sorry about that. The Metropole was the new social center for the bourgeois colony. Its main restaurant was a Russian peasant's dream of capitalist splendors. Immense candelabra, oversized lights, heavy furniture, a jazz band of symphony orchestra proportions. The chief pride of the restaurant, its ultra-bourgeois touch, was a great circular pool where lights and rather proletarian-looking fishes played. On grand occasions, the chef in cap and apron emerged from the sanctum with a net over his shoulder and captured a fish to cook for special customers bearing foreign currency. The dancing couples rotated around the pool, and sometimes an unsteady customer joined the fishes to the great delight of the assembled crowd. Now, what I love about this paragraph is that this could be about Fitzgerald's life at the Plaza in New York in the 20s. It is crazy that this is what was going on, as I say, around the corner from the Kremlin and a few blocks from the headquarters of the secret police. So this is where my story is set. Now, everything that I have just told you is not in the book. Right? It is not in the book. You know, I'm not a historian. All this stuff is valuable for me. This is not valuable for you and your experience of the novel necessarily. The novel is about individuals. Most importantly, it's about the Count, who at the age of 30, entering the hotel, has been stripped of his possessions, his family. In a way, more importantly, he's been put in an environment where everything that he values about Russian culture is going to be uprooted systematically over the course of a decade by the new regime. And this is how the story begins, with him in this state of mind and in this situation. And in the course of the 32 years he's in the hotel, he needs to establish new relationships. He has to find new causes for happiness, however small, and he ultimately needs to find a new sense of purpose. And that's really ultimately what the book is about. But I hope you give it a shot. Anyway, thank you very much.
Reading both of your previous books, one of the things that intrigued me was the difference in structure. And I know with your new book, you've got a very interesting structure planned for the reader. And I know, Nell, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how you work with structure, and I thought it'd be interesting if you could each talk about how you structured your books. Amor?
Go for it.
Well, I have 3 novels out as of today, and they're structured quite differently. The second one, Mislaid, which came out last year, has chapters, and they're these self-contained chapters almost, whereas Nicotine, the new one that I read from just now, has about 105 scenes and no chapters at all. And it, after the sections that I read, it jumps forward into about April of 2016. And the novel concludes next month with about 100 short scenes. And the structure of Mislaid was very sort of inspired. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. It was inspired by a rather Russian formalist idea of an abstract form, almost as if I were writing a piece of classical music, where I was saying to myself, okay, I want to establish two motifs, separate them and bring them back together in the form of a family. Well, in Nicotine, what I was aiming for quite consciously was to replicate the effect of watching TV. That was my initial ambition, because I got so tired of listening to people say that TV is the new novel, and that if you watch like, Boardwalk Empire or The Wire or all that other stuff, that you are seeing this art form reborn. Because to my mind, I have a doctorate in media studies, and it's very clear to me, if to no one else, that when you watch an audiovisual medium, all you're getting is a very superficial visual image and dialogue. And to say that this is going to supplant the novel, I think is a little silly. So I decided, well, but if it's what everybody wants, you and my friends who are novelists were telling me that, TV is where the action is, it's the wave of the future. So I decided to write a novel that would be made up entirely of dialogue and descriptions of visuals, what you would see on the screen if you were seeing it on a DVD, if you were binge watching it. And because what I wanted to do was create the effect of binge watching, what Dan Brown does, just keep you watching this thing. That's why I made it have these many, many very short scenes, because if you do watch TV and think about what you're seeing, you'll notice that a scene on TV might have like an establishing shot, 4 lines of dialogue, and it's over. You're already at the next scene. My scenes are a lot longer than that, partly because once I sold the book, it came to my attention, or maybe my editor told me or something, that it was supposed to be a novel, so I turned it into one.
What was it beforehand? I mean, but it sounds like it was a novel from the beginning.
It was a pilot.
Okay,
It wasn't subtitled Nicotine, a novel. It was Nicotine, a series. Okay. And the ending was that it just goes on for 60 more seasons, and it ends when the Earth is hit by a very large asteroid.
Okay. Spoiler alert, I guess.
No, I changed that ending.
Okay, good. Okay. Like Nell, the structures of my books are different, but the structure of this book is a little odd in that it begins on the day of the Count's house arrest, and then the chapters depict what happens a day later, 2 days later, 5 days later, 10 days later, 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, to the day.
Is that a Fibonacci sequence or something?
Well, sort of. 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, 16 years forward to the day. And then it goes in reverse. From that point, it's 8 years later, then 4 years, then 2 years, then 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 3 weeks, and right down to 10 days, 5 days, 2 days, 1 day, until the very exciting conclusion. So yes, it has this sort of strange accordion structure, which I'm glad to say that, I feel tentative about even describing this to you. I wouldn't if he hadn't asked. But for most readers who come to the book, it's invisible to them. It's meant to be invisible. It's not a part of the story. It's a structure that, for me, is kind of productive in the way that, the constraints of a sonnet can be productive to a poet. 14 lines, 10 beats per line, iambic pentameter. You adopt that constraint, and then you try to invent something that fits within it that doesn't feel like in any way that it's constrained by that shape or defined by that shape. And to some degree, that's what happens in the course of this novel. But these things don't work if they don't feel organic to the reader. And I think the reason this does work, I'm not trying to sell it to you, but it's because it makes its sense. It's because you kind of want the granularity at the beginning, as you're first in the hotel, kind of learning about the life in the hotel. But then you kind of want to see, well, what happens, later, and as this change occurs, and as Russian society changes, but there is a conclusion, and so you want that move back towards granularity as you approach that. like you, and I saw that in
That is so clever.
Is it? Well, I don't know.
Yeah, because when I'm reading a novel, I always want to just skip ahead to the end and see
Right.
what happens.
See, exactly. So this way I can just cut out whole like decades without any problem. But I noticed that you did this a similar thing, and I was reading your novel earlier today, and I saw the skipping. You mentioned one of them, but there's sort of like two in the first 20 pages, right, of significant time that you zip over, or maybe even three.
Yes, it's like the triple jump. There's a jump and then another jump, and then it just goes and goes.
Yeah, but it's very liberating, I think, for the writer and for the reader. When that's done well, that's extremely liberating for I think for both of us, as opposed to that feeling of, oh, he's gonna bog me down in everything that happens between 1947 or whatever, between January and June. Sometimes you just want to take the reader to the next landmark that matters. But anyway, yeah, so they're similar there in some ways.
Hi, I had a question for Nell. I was interested in your discussion of this, what sounds pretty much like a screenplay format, which is basically action and dialogue and kind of leaving out all but the minimal description. And I find that that's more interesting to me. I find that as a reader, my attention span causes me to skip the description and just go for the dialogue. So made a lot of sense.
Thanks. I had sort of the same feeling myself doing it. And at the same time, what I realized when I was going back, because I stayed, except for that ending, I took out the asteroid and put in some story. When I was adding the psychological detail that makes it novelistic, I realized in a sense I was doing what an actor does when he reads a play. And I was reading the dialogue and thinking, okay, what is going through this guy's head when he says this? And so I was doing the work of an actor, or what a musician does when he reads a score and plays it, with my own work. It was interesting, but I know exactly what you mean. There are, of course, there are different kinds of novels. Steinbeck wrote *The Grapes of Wrath*, and he also wrote *Of Mice and Men*. But of course, I think he consciously wrote *Of Mice and Men* just to be filmed. So.
This question's for Nell Zink. In your new book, Nicotine, some people have speculated that you used to live in Philadelphia and you used to live in West Philly. Some people have speculated that some of your characters in the new book might be based on characters from your time in West Philly. Is that true? Could you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, the really evil, satanic, sex-obsessed guy is based on Jamie Graham. Just kidding. No, nobody in the book is based on anyone in West Philly, because that would be like shooting fish in a barrel.
And this question's also for Nell Zink. As we saw in the passage you read from Nicotine, I think sometimes you end up putting your characters in situations.
My new bifocals are not serving me well. Okay. Yeah.
You put characters in situations that are uncomfortable for them and also uncomfortable for the readers, and seem to kind of relish it. So I was wondering if you ever feel like, like you're putting your characters through sort of a cruel, series of events, and ever feel like you're doing, there's ever a point where you feel like you're being too cruel to a character?
What's strange is that when you were asking the question, even before you got to the word cruel, I had this sudden revelation that when I was young, like 19, and at college, and not out of my mind, but I was a little odd, and one of my favorite books was The Theater and Its Double by Antonin Artaud, about the theater of cruelty, and I liked that idea, and I would sometimes, like in a philosophy seminar, try to put the principles of the theater of cruelty into play, and that was a really poor idea. So it may be that as I've matured, I've learned to confine that impulse to my fiction, at least to some extent. But I do kind of know what you mean.
Amor, the Count and his aristocracy is kind of anathema to the revolution, yet in the book, he's such a noble character and so courageous and such a nice guy. So how did he end up being that way if he's exactly the opposite of what this revolution is supposed to create?
Well, I mean, I think he's not a product of the revolution, obviously. He's a product of 19th century upbringing, and that's what's shaped him. And you're right, there's a clear contrast between the world that he's inherited, that he grew up in, and the one that is being created around him. I think for those who read the book, the valuable thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind is that for figures in the European aristocracy in the 19th century, they view manners very differently than we do. I think that we in our society kind of think of manners as the nice sort of frosting on top of behavior. It's a nicety, a social nicety. Whereas for 19th century aristocratic figure and for the Age of Enlightenment thinkers, for the Stoics, going back, the notion was very different. Manners was an outward expression of an inward struggle. And the inward struggle was with the 7 sins. We have greed, lust, anger, impatience. We have the impulses for those things, all of us. And the Stoics and the Age of Enlightenment thinkers thought we can master those bad impulses. And manners were a part of a tool for that. You did it through thought, you did it through reflection, but you also did it through using your manners to slow down the process. Before you say that impatient thing, or that crass remark, or that impolite thing to a member of the opposite sex, civility would stop that. And ideally, like in the interim, you would regain your composure and not go down that road. And so the Count is definitely a reflection of this era where the internal struggle with there's a moral integrity attached to manners. It's not simply a social nicety. And yes, the Russians overthrow that mindset for their own reasons and prioritize very different human behaviors: urgency, frankness, brutalness. They really valued those things to make changes occur. And so you have kind of ultimately a war between two sensibilities, a 19th century sensibility and a 20th century one, taking place in the context of the book. So I'm going to ask you a question about that, because your book is to some degree, and you said it at the beginning, is about there's a generational element, or I don't know how you want to put it, the father with the ethos of the 1960s, and then a very different kind of ethos, it seems like, in his children going down as they get younger and younger. I mean, is that a part of the story more broadly? Because I haven't gotten to the end of it. Is there is through the narrative, or are you looking at the battle between different eras and their viewpoints?
I didn't write that description of the book.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And in fact, as often happens, my generation is neglected when people describe the book. Generation X, it's like it's been X'd out. Well, I'm actually a baby boomer. I was born in '64, but that's the last year of the American baby boom. And so Matt, the character that I read, that was in the passage I read from, he's in the whole book. He's from this very, he feels neglected, like no one pays any attention to him. He was just expected to work hard. He came of age in the Reagan era, and it was just like, oh, well, the economy's doing fine. You better get out there and do something and be pragmatic about it. And I see sort of differences in sort of ethical and sexual and social and political mores between these generations. But I would never say you can generalize, but you can take things you've experienced and put them into characters. And if you get details right, then it comes alive for the people reading it, which is always fun to see. You put a few words in the right place, and suddenly they're imagining someone they know.
Amor, would you talk a bit about how you pick the events in Russian history to filter in terms of what the Count has to experience?
The book takes place inside the hotel, and so it is respectful and interested in the historical events in Russia, which are quite dramatic, between 1920 and 1950. but it's not a work of history. You know, I kind of like to think of it as, you know, we look at Henry V by Shakespeare, which is still a very exciting play to read or see today. We don't turn to Henry V to have a history, to have a historical understanding of the 100 Years' War or the Battle of Agincourt even. You know, he's using the chronicle of history and the contours of history to create these three-dimensional characters with contradictions and whims and passions, and he's putting them in situations where their sentiments and their thoughts are going to come into to some degree conflict. And ideally, through the poetry of his language, he gives us a glimpse of the human condition in a fashion that's universal and timeless. You know, that's the project. And you know, it's less about, as I say, adding to the historical record per se. And the book my work is doing a similar thing in that it's using these events in Russia as a contour. Its goal is really to create the individuals and the conflicts and to reach something which is timeless or universal, but which the elements of Russian history are coming through the door of the hotel by virtue of, you know, the people who are coming and going and over the passage of time. Even though the Count is trapped in the hotel, we get glimpses of what the society outside the hotel is going through at the various decades.
Hello, how are you? I'm asking a question about your choice to, you said you wrote through high school and college. Did you make a conscious choice to select another career, do that, and then say, okay, I'm going back to writing, or was there some?
Yeah, I was writing in New York City. I was 25. I wasn't in love with being alone all day at that point in time. Now I am, but at the time I wasn't. And I was looking for a job, and I was looking at my peers, painters, dancers, musicians, writers in the city. We were all friends in the East Village, whatever. And some of them were bartenders. You know, some of them had bit jobs in their passion. So, like, you know, writers working as editorial assistants at publishing houses, and you know, painters working as secretaries at galleries and stuff. And it just seemed like those weren't working better. You know, my friends who were bartenders, they were exhausted all day, you know, having been up till 4 in the morning having a good time. My friends working like in publishing houses didn't want to write when they got home. They're like, I want to watch TV, you know. So I was like, oh, well, I figured I'd look for work as a research analyst. I joined a friend of mine who was just starting his own firm, and 21 years later, we still were next to each other. You know, our offices were next to each other. So it was kind of earning my keep early on, but it was a fascinating field. We had a lot of fun. My clients were great. My colleagues were great. You know, it was a great adventure. But along the way, I was like, if I don't get back to writing fiction, I took about 10 years off where I was not writing fiction. I was like, if I don't get back to doing that, I will, by the time I'm 50, be bitter and a drinker, you know, and now I just drink. Now I'm just a drinker. Right? I'm not as bitter as I was. You know, I would be, but yeah, so it was just kind of an accident to some degree, but then I followed it through. Yeah, and then eventually I got around to writing writing fiction on the job, and then I retired 3 years ago when I started writing this book.
Nell, I think your journey was a little different, right?
Yeah, I was offered a lot of jobs in investment banking, but I just consistently turned them down. Yeah.
There you go.
Well, we can leave it at that. Ladies and gentlemen, Nell Zink, Amor Towles.